everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today as part of our Dion Leadership webinar series. Today, we are going to be talking about the topic of executive presence, and I have Steve and Joe with me today. So I'm going to kick it over to them for us to get started.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everybody for taking your time out of your busy day to join another one of our Dion Leadership webinar series. My name's Steve Dion, and I'm the founder and CEO of Dion Leadership. And I'm proud to say that Dion Leadership is now a Gallagher company. Uh, Excited to share that, now that we're part of a 70,000 person company, we're still going to be doing programs like this for our local leadership and OD community. And excited to have Joe LaDuke, one of our own, on our show today. And Joe is our practice leader of learning and development and has been out speaking about executive presence in a couple of different forums. He was invited for HRCI to do a deep dive series on executive presence. And we've had such a great interest in it that we wanted to have it on our Dion Leadership webinar program as well. So before I turn it over to Joe, I wanted to just share a little bit more about Dion Leadership if you haven't been part of one of our programs. Why we show up every day is that we believe that in organizations, employees should start every day excited and end every day accomplished. That is a goal that is achievable, that is important for organizations, and it's really important for societies, for people to walk in every day feeling like they are excited to do what they do, with people they want to do it with, and passionate about the work that they do, and then leave at the end of each day saying, I nailed it. This was great. I enjoyed this. I'm ready to go tackle the rest of my life. And we create programs and conditions for organizations to do just that. The types of programs that we work in are really in four different solution areas: individual coaching, team and group development, and consulting. And really, I just wanted to pause before we turn it over to our kind of executive presence content. Sort of why are we talking about this subject and where did it come from? So a couple of years ago, we decided to dig deep into executive presence, and Joe is going to share a little bit more about the models that we created, but it really came from our clients saying that this was a struggle that they had. So you can see in this executive coaching lane, we would regularly hear, we want you to coach an executive because they just don't have the executive presence to make the impact that they need to make in an organization. Or for our team development programs, they would say, can you teach executive presence, not just presentation skills, but how you show up in a way that is authentic and people want to be led to let you lead them. And as well as working in an executive team format, like showing up in a team in a way that creates impact. So this content really spans across all of our areas. We do have an ebook that we'll be sharing with you at the end and a full program around this. And we just know it's a great topic, and we think we have a little bit of a different and deeper take on what executive presence is and what it means, because we're looking at it not just from a training kind of mechanics, do this, say that perspective, but how do I know who I am so I can show up better? And with that, Joe has some phenomenal content to share with you. I will be moderating the chat throughout this, so please use the chat feature. If you have any questions, comments, I can stop along the way and interject those items. And just encourage you to bring this to your organization. And without further ado, Mr. Joe LaDuke.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that gracious introduction. It is great to be here with all of you this fine feathered day to talk about executive presence. I am particularly excited because, one, I haven't led one of our Dion webinars in a minute, and it's just exciting to be back in the seat. Two, this is the last Dion webinar of the year, interestingly enough. And three, it's the first Dion/Gallagher webinar that we are doing under that Gallagher umbrella. So I'm excited for a whole bunch of reasons. All right. And as Steve pointed out, I want to reiterate this once more. We are going to be providing you our ebook on this topic that breaks down the model that I will be talking to you about today. The ever so delightful Lauren Wilson is going to be posting that in the chat towards the end of the webinar. And also, that chat is an open pipeline. So if you hear something I say and it prompts a question, or you have an insight or observation that you would like to share, please post it in the chat. Steve is going to be moderating that chat. I've already spoken with him. We can kind of keep this a little bit more live, in tune and on time. And if he can interject with some questions, I welcome them with open arms. So if anything we talk about today prompts deeper thought and you want to put your voice out there a little bit, feel free to post those thoughts in chat. All right. So let's get into it. Like I've already said, I'm excited. Steve mentioned this once already. We've been hearing about executive presence for a little while now from our clients. So we thought, you know what? It's time to put nose to the grindstone. Let's put the work in and really like kind of go through a trove of research. Our instructional design team, Terry Shell, did a great job working with Steve and others to do an abundant amount of research to break this down and say, okay, when we talk about executive presence, what exactly do we mean? So I invite you to post your thoughts on what executive presence means in the chat right now, even if it's a simple word or two. Like the first word that comes to mind when you hear the term, put it in there if you so desire. Because what we find is that it's really an umbrella term. It can mean a lot of different things to everyone. So what we've tried to do is give it some nuance, give it something that's sticky, something that you can even put in your back pocket and practice. All right.
So, Joe, we got a lot of confidence coming up, credibility, composure. Let's see how
Yeah.
that matches
A lot
with
of C words, I would
a
bet.
lot of C.
Confidence, credibility, composure, command, credibility. You know, these are some of the
Authenticity,
more usual suspects.
gravitas. I see that. We'll be coming back to that term
Reading my
momentarily.
mind already, folks. So, one of the other explanations slash definitions that commonly arises when I'm in conversations around executive presence is this quote unquote it factor. It's like somebody just has it. Almost like they're born with it. Makes me think of that old Maybelline commercial. Maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. Well, maybe it's neither. Because the idea that it's this innate trait, that it's intrinsic, it's something that you just have or you don't, quite frankly, we believe is false. And if anything, the research shows it is untrue to say and believe that. But in fact, executive presence is developable. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how it's developable momentarily. So a quotation, Sylvia Ann Hewlett is one of the leading scholars and authors on the topic of executive presence. That's literally the title of one of her books, Executive Presence 2.0. And in the research, one of the quotations we pulled that we thought at least encapsulated a fair amount of this executive presence definition slash terminology is what is before you now. An amalgam of qualities that telegraphs you are in charge or you deserve to be. And looking at those definitions that you provided in the chat, we're already seeing that. Someone who has poise, someone who is confident, someone who is comfortable in their position of leadership and authority, so much that it resonates with the people they lead. So much when they are in the room, they are in the conversation, what they have to say and what they don't have to say still speaks volumes to their audiences. So let's keep going. What are we going to do today? I think before we set sail out of the harbor, we should have a compass in hand. So let me do a quick breakdown of where the day will take us, really the hour will take us. Why is this an important topic? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about its effectiveness and its impact. We're going to talk about 3 domains of executive presence and their drivers. That'll be more of a nuanced look at the model that we've developed. And I did want to take a brief moment to personalize this just a little bit, to get you thinking about, okay, what are my personal strengths and what are my development areas when it comes to these drivers, when it comes to these domains? What are the stories I'm telling myself about these different elements? And then lastly, and this will be just a brief flicker of a moment, but I want you to start thinking about how this can also be actionable. We'll talk about a mindset piece to this, but we're also going to talk about a behavioral piece. And it's like, okay, at some point, it's boots to pavement. How do you begin to practice executive presence? And over the next 40 minutes, my goal is to give you cannon fodder that can be sticky and actionable that you can begin to practice, or you can help others, even if you're coaching others, to help them grow in this area as well. But before, I'm teasing you just a little bit, before we get into the model, there's a couple of quick pit stops that I would like to make. The first one is a timeline, then versus now. Because one of the things I think it's important to do is perhaps dispel some antiquated, anachronistic, outdated views on what executive presence means. I mentioned just a few minutes ago that our team did a lot of research on this topic, and I will tell you, there were 3 key ingredients that throughout all of the research continue to pop up. And those 3 ingredients, and I want to tip my hat to whoever put in the chat the first one, gravitas. Those 3 ingredients were prominent throughout all of the research. Gravitas, communication, and appearance. And really, in terms of priority, they're listed in that way. Appearance being really the less, I would say, dare I say, kind of important of the 3. But what about yesterday? I just mentioned a moment ago, that which is outdated. If we're talking about a more traditional, conventional definition around executive presence, it's not uncommon that we might bump into a couple of archetypes. So, for example, if someone has presence, perhaps they were really authoritative, right? They led through mandate, they led through directive. At times, maybe they were even a little bit too direct, borderline impatient. Sometimes, perhaps it even translated into aggression, which made people fearful. But there was a definition around that said, hey, they were present, they were in charge. And it risked almost being a little draconian or authoritative. Another archetype that we saw, or even continue to see, it still surfaces. Charisma, charm, your ability to kind of assuage a conversation, and just overall kind of be likable, at least to certain parties, let's say. But more importantly, it was this idea that was just something people innately possessed. They just kind of had it. And I've said this before, what the research shows is that that's actually untrue. If one even desires to be a little bit more charismatic, a little bit more engaging in how they interact with others, there are tactics you can employ. There's a mindset you can endorse that translates into decision-making and behaviors that can make you a more engaging individual. So this brings us to today. When we talk about executive presence today, terms that are much more relevant to its definition involve authenticity, a certain degree of confidence in being yourself, knowing who you are, what's important to you, and operating from that genuine place. Inclusiveness, and I don't mean just knowing the language of inclusion, I mean that it emanates from you. It emanates from you in your decisions, in your behaviors. You are intentional about creating space where there are open minds and people feel safe and there is trust and people feel seen and heard, which really involves the latter 2 bullet points as well. You operate from a place of curiosity. You listen even at the higher levels. You practice active listening and you show a respect for others. These are now the terms that we're seeing really breathe life, a necessary and long overdue life and definition into the term of executive presence. All right. Second pit stop. So a couple other things I want to clear off the table before we get into the model. What we talk about today is not about homogeny and conformity. Again, there may have been an age where when we talked about executive presence, it means that you played a part. Even if, dare I say, it felt like it went against a person's values, even if some part of it felt forced, which I hate to say, and just in speaking to clients was very much some people's truths, we're saying, okay, that those days are yesterday, right? This is not about necessarily fitting in a way that goes against who you are, but instead, executive presence is an elevated and professional expression of self. It's not just achieved by extroverts. Again, a lot of times, I think about, even if some of you are familiar with the DISC model, someone who scores as an I style, someone who's very open, someone who's very gregarious, someone who's very charismatic, can kind of be the life of the party, right? Oftentimes they're like, oh, this person exudes presence. And in many ways that could still be true. But what could also be true is the person who perhaps doesn't say as much, maybe is a little bit on the quieter side, someone who scores, even to stick with the disc for a moment, as a C, which, by the way, yours truly, if any of you are familiar with the disc, I actually score as a C. It's to say the loudest in the room, first of all, isn't always the most learned and doesn't necessarily translate to having presence. But there are opportunities for the softer side of Sears to kind of be known, right? There are opportunities for that quieter voice to still lead in front and do a tremendous job. Last couple, important for leaders at all levels. I will be brief to this point to say oftentimes we think of executive presence really at the senior level, C levels, senior executives, things of this nature. The truth is, us cultivating more presence in how we show up, it optimizes all of our relationships. It makes all of our relationships the better for it and healthier. And holistically, that just improves a whole workplace culture. Context matters. So I will be brief here in saying, it could be the role that you're in. It could be the team that you're on and that team's culture. It could be the organizational culture at large. It could be geography. There are a number of influential factors that can also impact how we define executive presence. They are, if you think about a prism and how light passes through a prism, it can kind of cascade colors on how we define executive presence. Now, the individual still has agency in how they choose to show up and whether or not how they choose to show up aligns with that role or that culture, but these can be other influential factors. And I'll jump to the last one to repeat something I've already said. This is developable. It is learned, or you can learn to improve and learn to optimize. It is not a static trait. All right. I will take pause. I would say, I think we're ready to jump in the model. But Steve, I don't know if anything popped up in the chat that you thought was worth sharing. If not, I'm going to keep rocking and rolling.
Well, as you go into this, as I'm looking through some chats, if you could weave in a little bit more about growing future, like instilling future growth and being resilient with leaders. Like how will this help in not just the individual person is what I'm reading into this kind of thread, but in terms of instilling future growth.
You mean, let's say, like within an organization?
Yeah, within leaders within an organization.
Yeah, I think because I think it fosters a really important conversation about within an organizational culture, what are the expectations from a leader? Not that we're trying to homogenize it, but it's like, okay, I'll even mention the word values again, but it's like, what are we looking for from our leadership? And executive presence is a fantastic way to initiate conversation around values, around purpose, around communication. I could just keep riffing here. But if we're talking about creating a vital, thriving workplace community, oftentimes that starts at the top in how our leaders are showing up. So brokering and facilitating a conversation around presence and saying, okay, as a community of practice, how do we look at this term? What is it? What do we want it to mean for us? Because you want to know what? To be really candid, that's a great filter. That's a great filter to figure out who you want on your team and who's maybe not the best fit. And if they're not the best fit, are they coachable? Right? Is there enough there that they want to practice? They want it too. They can work on it and we can all be kind of, on the same side, or hey, maybe not. That's the quick answer.
Well, and as you get into the model, I would just say too, part of what we're seeing in the world of work today is this idea of continued burnout, continued disengagement. And so as we go through this model, I think it's important to help think about that executive presence isn't there to help motivate somebody to achieve a specific goal only, or it isn't about you as a person to just sort of grandstand and show up. I think today, applying this in the context of creating conditions where employees want to give their all in the office in the work that they do is a really important element. So I think as you go through the model, you'll see there are places where if a leader shows up with the presence they need, they can lean into some of those difficult conversations. They'll be more attuned to what employees are looking for and needing from a leader to help solve some of those current organizational challenges.
And to just piggyback on that, I would invite you really throughout this conversation today to think about leaders that you either know or perhaps have worked under that for you really kind of embody what executive presence means. And to even think about, okay, when I was in that conversation with them, or even in some cases when I've heard it, like when they entered the room, the energy shifted. Everybody kind of almost leveled up simultaneously, paid a little bit more attention, became a little bit more focused, wanted to give that extra little inch, right? Like it's like, oh, what was that? What was that about how they were showing up? That's something you can mine from. But then, two, to Steve's point, look at the impact that it has on that community, on that audience, and how it just continues to lift people up. And it goes back to even our mission. It creates the kind of workplace where people are excited to come to work. They enjoy working with the people in their community. And when they unplug for the day, they feel a sense of accomplishment. They feel a sense of fulfillment, at least more days than they don't. Presence is actually an integral component or ingredient to that kind of community. Okay, we're going to keep going. So, in the research, we have consolidated this down to 3 domains that comprise executive presence. Okay, nothing like a good old Venn diagram to show this. So we have mindset, behaviors, and personal brand. And I'm going to speak briefly to each one of these with the last half hour that we had today. Executive presence is where they meet in the middle. Okay. So just kind of take that in because you'll see the bulleted ingredients under each of the domains. I'm going to refer to those as drivers. I will tell you in advance, it was not easy to narrow down the number of drivers under each domain to 4. Could you make an argument that there could be a much longer list? Yes. But for the sake, at the very least, of practicality, we left it to 4. And these were the drivers we continued to see pop up over all kinds of research. So we thought they were the most relevant. All right.
And I would make the comment that as I look back to the chat, I would say over half of these were noted when you said to the audience to think about what they thought executive presence was. So some face
Totally.
validity to it as well here.
Yep, definitely. Mindset. Mindset's our first domain. And the model does pull from a cognitive behavioral approach. Very much works from the idea that the mindset we grow, the mindset we cultivate, influences our behaviors and actions. All right. So the stories we tell about ourselves, about an experience, about a situation, about a relationship are very impactful to how we show up. and the decisions we make, the choices we make, the behaviors we demonstrate. All right. The 4 drivers I'm going to go over in terms of mindset are confidence, authenticity, intentionality, and integrity. So let's get at it. Confidence. Yes, you're self-assured. You believe in your abilities and judgment. I don't need to wax poetic too long. I think we all know what the word confidence means by Webster's dictionary. But I do want to say a little bit more. When we talk about confidence, there's a few other little cherries I want to add to this sundae. 1, confidence does not mean the absence of fear. What confidence tends to really point at is our willingness to prepare and plan, to put the time and the work in. Confidence then, if we think about confident individuals, they tend to have a healthy relationship with risk and even with failure, with exploring the unknown. They're a little bit more attuned with discomfort because what they see on the other side has value. Confidence can be a starting point for so many other essential ingredients, even if we think of decision making. You may not always have all of the answers, but you have belief that you've done enough preparation and planning to move from point A to point B, and then we will work from there. Confidence is also something that can be infectious, which is one of the great things about executive presence. When you are in the company of someone who is confident, but at the same time is open-minded, kind, compassionate, and creates space for you to feel heard and seen, that we have found in our own work can be very fertile soil for other people's sense of empowerment and confidence to shine as well.
There's been a lot written about imposter syndrome, and I'm sure many of the folks that are listening in have heard that term and have heard that. We coach to that regularly. This speaks to the opposite of that. Like, how do I say I am worthy to be there and I believe in my abilities to show up? And it is a practice or a journey to 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 do the self-talk and to have enough reps under your belt to go, I've got this. But then you shine when you do.
Mm-hmm. And I think that point, Steve, drives home the storytelling aspect of this too. I've said it in other webinars where it's like, hey, I wish I'd been, told this a long time ago. Just because you have a thought doesn't mean you need to believe it. You have agency over your thoughts. So what kind of story are you telling yourself? Are you operating from a place of curiosity? Are you operating from a place of possibility and growth? How is that weaving then into the stories you're telling about yourself, your capabilities, your ability to prepare and plan, the relationships you have with others, the experiences you find yourselves in? This is a very powerful piece, so I'm spending a little bit more time on it, but we'll move on. Authenticity. We talked about this too already. When we talk about authenticity, we talk about your willingness to put the work in when it comes to clarity around your value system, your sense of purpose, what drives you, ultimately what you find to be meaningful and important. And I'm going to do a quick nod. I wrote about I've used this many, many times. I did not create it, but I've used it in a ton of times. There's a great exercise called Peaks and Valleys. It's in the blog post of our website where we write our blogs. It's a very simple exercise that you can do to gain clarity on what your values are. Because operating from a place of what's important and meaningful to you actually has a very close relationship with confidence and even integrity, a couple of other terms that we're going to weave into today's conversation. So regardless, I use a maritime metaphor. You're in a boat, regardless of the water around you, whether the water is calm and serene and placid, or you're looking at 10-foot swells, anchoring to your values is what gives you your sea legs. It's like a compass for effective decision making.
Joe, here's a question before we move on. What are the early warning signs that confidence is tipping into overconfidence? And how do you coach leaders to back to center?
Confidence tipping into overconfidence. One area where I think or working with clients where I've seen changes is a change in the dynamic of their relationships, whether it be with people or with the work itself that they're doing and the results that are showing. Ultimately, it has consequences. So whether you start to see people show up differently in your relationships, or simply put, the work that you're delivering that you think you're ever so confident in begins to show a few more holes in the armor, and maybe even the feedback changes. Those are two quick and easy things that come to mind. I don't think it's confined to just those two
Yeah.
things, but for the sake of brevity, those would be two
And I
areas.
would say too, if you are saying to yourself, I've been here before. I know this answer. I don't need anybody else. I'm really good at this. If your self-talk is about I don't need others, then you probably have to put some check into this and saying, hey, maybe the people closer to the work know this. I have to bring some humility to it. So, one way
Yeah,
you coach to that too is periodically doing a 360 with others. And in our coaching process, you'll be able to see where you and your direct reports or your peers are not aligned with some of those talks to raise some self-awareness.
great point, Steve. And one other thing I would add to that, and this involves some inward reflection. If you find, whether in personal or professional relationships, you're getting feedback that is perhaps contrary to what you've typically received, and I would say even more specifically, you find yourself getting defensive, if your initial reaction may be to get kind of like hair on the back of the neck up, like what, like that, just to check in with yourself, just to give pause, like Steve said, like, hey, am I operating from a place of humility and understanding, right? Doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything the other person is saying, but are you even allowing the opportunity for self-reflection or introspection to examine how you're showing up and how that may be impacting other people or results? Because if the only thing you do is focus on your intention and what you think, you're living in a myopia. And that's going to damage relationships and that's going to damage work. So we're going to
Yep,
keep it.
and the chat's confirming pretty much what you're saying.
Let's talk for a brief moment about intentionality. Again, these values, these aforementioned values, but I will even include goals. They don't just kind of stay in this abstract space. They don't like live in this, this ether, so to speak, but they actually translate to your choices. They translate to your decision making. You are self-aware of how you're showing up and how the decisions you make are impacting others. And you're also aware in such way that you are looking to create results and the kind of impact that lifts, that sure is in service to the business need, whatever that may be, but is also trying to optimize and create a kind of, health within your relationships, your work relationships too, that's not lost. Okay. Integrity. This tends to be the connective tissue. It's part of the bedrock. It's the tie that binds so many of these together, right? But you're committed to ethical practices and principles, to honesty, that you're transparent, that the way you talk doesn't change depending on who's in the room, but there's a consistency in your goodwill and not just your good intent or positive intent, but how you see that through even when things get difficult or challenging, but that you're operating from a place of betterment, not just for oneself, but for that aforementioned community of practice. And you're willing to also invite an open space to have that kind of conversation about that intent and impact, that it's not walled off.
There was a comment too about insecurity creeping in might have an impact your confidence, and I think this is where some of that speaks to this. Is once somebody gets to a certain level, do they feel that they need to follow along with the organization's way of doing? And I'm here, I don't want to lose what I have now. And that's a really big trap. So the four mindsets you just went through, Joe, I think speak to a person having their own view, even though you can be a team player and make decisions with the organization, yet have your own point of view, and others need to be able to believe that you have those points of view, and that'll come through as you get into the behaviors model.
Okay, but I want to say this for a second too, because insecurity and what you had to share, Steve, thank you for that. It also kind of prompts another thought for me. Fear, okay? Growing a healthy relationship with fear. Because whether we're operating from a place of fear individually, or we're looking at a workplace community where fear is thriving, that tends to be a very dysfunctional place, both for the individual as well as that community. So managing one's relationship with fear, and if we're looking at it even through that lens of insecurity, right? Again, what are the stories that you're telling yourself? What is your relationship with making mistakes? I mean, it sounds trite to say it, mistakes can be some of our best teachers. And where that we've seen that get tricky is if, we're talking about a culture where it's the old mantra of, well, failure is not an option and mistakes are weaponized. It's like, well, if that's the case, then that may not be the best home for you if we're talking about the individual. But then if we're also seeing that in the texture of that community, if we look at it more through that organizational lens, it's like, okay, well, what kind of approach can we begin to layer in to change some of those dynamics at a broader scale? Because that's a big part of the work that we do, to really kind of go into that workplace culture and look at it systematically and say, okay, what are some of the little widgets that are working that we want to keep? And then what's outdated? What's not working here anymore that we can toss? Okay, we'll keep going. I put a series of questions in here. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it, to be honest with you, but I think they're good prompts. And I've put the same questions at the end of every domain because I think they're worth pondering. All right. So I did mention at the beginning that some of this was going to be personalized, whether it was to you, the way you coach others, or how you think about kind of, let's say programmatically or organizationally, how you want to impact the landscape of where you work. It's like, okay, to beat the storytelling, drum one more time. When you look at each of these drivers, what's the story you're telling yourself about each of them, particularly through your leadership capability? What's the impact of that story on you? What kind of outcome is it driving? And what parts of that story are worth keeping? And what perhaps can you put down? What perhaps can you let go, discard, is finally worth changing? Again, I put these questions in here. They'll come at the end of every domain. The mindset piece is often where it starts because it leads the behaviors that follow. And I'm going to use that as a segue to get into the behaviors. So again, 4 drivers. There could certainly be more than 4, but these are the ones that we saw pop up time and time again in the research. We have communication, savvy, command, and decisiveness. To Steve's point earlier, great job, all of you, because I think at least 3 of these popped up in the chat. So kudos to everyone. And someone mentioned gravitas, and I did want to make a quick stop here as well. It is not uncommon when we did the work, we put the time in our research to see gravitas as a term that surfaced periodically as well. So this is from Rebecca Newton, another leading author. She's done executive programs, I think, at Harvard, London School of Economics or Business. She's written as well on the topic. But having gravitas, like when we talk about this, what are we talking about? It means you're taken seriously. Your contributions are important. They resonate with others. You have trust. You have respect. It increases your ability to persuade, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that, really invites community, unification, that proverbial middle ground where there's a common understanding and common coming together. And it can be great fuel, cannon fodder for which you begin to rise in your levels of leadership. Because ultimately what happens is it's not just about you. I've said this already too. The more we see with people who are present, the more they lift others around them. So it's not that the just individual leader benefits, but that the team benefits, the function or vertical benefits, the entire landscape improves as a result. That's what we're really up to here. Okay. So communication, not a surprise seeing this on here, but you can convey your ideas clearly, convincingly. Um, you listen well. You listen for what's being said, for what's not being said. You help others feel seen, heard, because I think I'm stating the obvious when I tell all of you, when a person begins to feel invisible to another human being, and this is in any relationship, that is when problems start to arise. And I would even take a quick detour when a person no longer sees the relevancy of their role, when they can no longer set anchor to their values and their sense of purpose, to the values and purpose of that role, and see how it also aligns with that of the organization. That is how we see retention dip. That is how we see well-being and confidence dip. It has an incredibly negative ripple effect. Communication is actually tied to that because you're creating space for people to feel seen and heard. It's not just about your message that you're communicating clearly, but you also create a safe and trusted space for other people to feel like they can communicate what's important to them as well.
Joe, I was saving this question for this moment because I think it ties together a couple things. In your model, how do you balance authenticity with situational demands when the culture subtly rewards conformity? And I paused here because I'll start, you can chime in here, but I would say a big part of this is communication. You can still say, I'm going along with the way you want this done. I'm not going to fight this situation. There are lots of people involved. But if you just sit back and are silent, you lose your power in that. If you communicate clearly, authentically, your viewpoints, you get it in the room. I think part of the balance, how you show up authentically, is through the behaviors, and this is the first of those.
Yeah.
So what
I
else
wouldn't
would
change
you add
really
to
much
that?
what you said. I think you're spot on. So thank you for doing that work for me there. I agree 110%. And I'm going to be, I guess, even a little bit more, I don't know if I would say abrasive, but I'm like, if you don't do that, you're going to hate your life, people, because you're internalizing it. It festers inside because now you're out of alignment with a place where you spend so much of your time and you're just holding it inside. That's toxic. It breeds resentment, right? Not only do your relationships suffer, but performance tends to be impacted negatively as well. I mean, it's like a domino effect that just continues to hit one domino after another. So what I think Steve is talking about is advocacy, self-advocacy in some cases, agency. You are 100% responsible for 50% of any relationship you're in. You don't control the whole thing, but to Steve's point, you can communicate what you see. And that takes confidence. I'm not saying that's always an easy thing to do. I mean, at the end of the road, if it's still not working, then you still have a choice to make as to whether or not that's the right landscape for you. But it doesn't mean that it's end game. It illuminates your choices, what you control, the impact you're looking to drive. And presence is very much in tune with that.
And that's where coaching comes in, or development, helping somebody realize that this is an and, not an or. It's not a I'm
Yes.
silent or to keep my job. It's a how can I do this to be authentic to myself
Yes.
within the political parameters of what's safe in an organization. And you can always find some other place to go that is safe but authentic, I believe.
Yep. Well said. Savvy. And we don't mean savvy in this kind of smarmy way. We're talking about it where there's an understanding of relationships within your organization, the people, the processes, just the entire landscape at a whole. And you know how to leverage relationships, not in a manipulative way, but in a way that is in service to the betterment of that relationship, the business need. If we're talking about savvy, you're able to kind of keep an eye on all of those things. There's a certain level of even agility and an adaptiveness that it involves. But you're able to kind of navigate that terrain. I get a little leery of a word like knowing the politics, because I think that sometimes can cast a certain kind of shade on it. But if I'm going to use the word, because I guess I already did, it's not to do so for selfish reasons. It's not to do it in this kind of Machiavellian fashion, but it's like, okay, how am I showing up in this community in such a way that I know the relationships, I can help kind of communicate in them clearly, I can optimize them, I can leverage them, I can meet, even if I don't see eye to eye with that other person, within what I can control, I can try to find a way to meet them halfway. I've got a bigger picture in mind for myself, perhaps my team, the people I work with, and again, how we can all level up. And savvy involves really kind of knowing those internal machinations, all of them, to kind of, you know, employ in such a way that it makes things better. Command. This, I think, had shown up in the chat. I think Savvy had too. But you are able to take control of situations. More so, you are able to illuminate a clear pathway in such a way where people also feel included. They don't feel like they are perhaps blindsided. It promotes respect. The choices you make and the way that you command, all right, isn't necessarily overly authoritative either. All right. It's not, I'd used the word draconian earlier, but it's done so in a way that is still respectful. You're not always going to please everybody. We know this, but it doesn't mean that certain, groups that may disagree still can't be acknowledged. Acknowledgement and agreement aren't necessarily the same thing, but there is this eye of inclusivity that's not lost on it either. And lastly, I'll mention words that I've used already in terms of poise, a certain degree of grace under pressure, an ability to stay focused in a way that people want to get behind you at the end of the day. All right. And that leads to our last driver under behaviors, which is decisiveness. And I will say, folks, this is actually really, really important because some of the feedback we get at times about leaders where problems may persist is if they're wayfish, if they waffle, if they struggle too much with making a decision and they're stuck in that lull. Decisiveness, your ability to make clear, timely decisions. That not only means you are taking action, but inspire the action and commitments of others, even if it's uncertain times. Because you may not know everything, but you prepare, you plan, you move from point A to point B. And once you're at point B, you take in that data so you can move to point C. But you realize you have to move. There has to be some decision that has to be made. It's this sweet spot between taking too long and not thinking about it enough. And I would add something to this, and it's going to come up later, accountability as well, that we make a decision and we take responsibility for the outcome, whatever that outcome may be. Rarely there is a plan in place that everything goes according to that plan in place. And sometimes that means great outcomes. Sometimes that means in the middle of outcomes. Sometimes that means not so positive outcomes. But regardless of that outcome, you take ownership and responsibility for what is yours. Right. And kind of what I told you last time, just a brief moment to look at the drivers once more before I move on. Communication, savvy, command, and decisiveness. What's the story you're telling yourself about each of these drivers? Maybe you're coaching somebody on your team right now. What is the story you're hearing them tell about any one of these drivers, and what impact is it having on you or that person or the people around you? What is the outcome that it's driving? Is it operating from a place of possibility, growth, curiosity, creativity, or is it operating from a place of deficit? What parts of that story are worth keeping, if any at all, and what is worth changing? Because it might be time to reframe to a different perspective. All right. Let's bring it home. Our last stop, our last domain is personal branding. That involves appearance, approachability, influence, and effectiveness. All right, so let's just get right into it because we got just over 10 minutes. Appearance. Appearance is, oh, I wish we had a whole other hour to talk about the appearance piece of this. So, it's when we talk about appearance, I will narrow it down to a couple of things. In our research, what showed up was that in terms of our own lizard brains, our primordial brains, it takes less than a second for us to kind of begin to formulate an opinion on someone or an impression when we first meet them, right? We meet them for the first time. That's what the research shows. Um, Thankfully, upon, however many years now of evolution, we've developed an ability to do a manual override of the system, right? So time and experience can help us, see that impression evolve. But the other thing I would say to this is agency, knowing that you have a choice in how you show up, and that's going to have impact on others at the end of the day. That's really what I would boil it down to for the sake of the time that we have today, right? This even is applicable in terms of physically how you're showing up in spaces. No one's telling you by any way. I'm certainly not in telling you that to talk about presence means appearance looks like this. No, no, no. It's to say you have 110% autonomy and agency and choice. It's just the recognition that will have impact, and the impact that it has, making sure as best you can, because you don't control other people, you can just influence really, that aligns with what you're looking for, and that you're inhabiting a space where, yes, you feel safe and you feel trusted, that appearance is what aligns well with that community, and you feel accepted. That's really important in the spaces we inhabit. Approachability. You're welcoming, you're open, you're easy to engage. Others feel comfortable around you, coming to you, knocking on your door. I will say, even with our clients, I think about, even we do a lot of work in manufacturing, and in some of the coaching work that I've seen and some of the leadership programs, one of the difference makers that we've seen is when leaders get out on the floor in the plants and they do rounds to meet with employees and whatnot. I'm just using that as a low-hanging fruit example, that they are out there shaking hands, they are approachable, they know names, they show a genuine interest, they are invested. And this even involves communication, because you create a space where people feel seen and heard, and you're not just talking about your own stuff, but you're inviting other people's stuff too. Influence, unsurprisingly, that's a word that's already popped up a few times today. You're able to help people, I wouldn't just say shape opinions, but you're able to help people operate from a place of empowerment, a place of belief and action, where they can see commonality with you, with the team's goals, with the organization's goals, right? And there's inspiration and there's motivation in that. So you're able to create a shared vision. You're able to create, a vision where what you are leading, whatever that may be, and what's behind you, you can draw the connective line for someone else to see that. And in a way that it inspires them, and now they're engaged. Now you have buy-in, and now we're lifting people up. Effectiveness, yes, you have to achieve. At the end of the day, there's that, it sounds a bit cliche to say it, but you're able to talk that talk, but walk the proverbial walk. You achieve results. You do achieve the desired outcomes, at least more than not. And you create opportunity for others to do the same. So sure, there's this individual leadership component, but one of the other points that we've wanted to drive home is that it's not just about the individual, but broadly speaking, you're able to create that kind of impact where other people are now more effective and confident in what they do too.
So here's one more question, if we can throw it in before we
Sure.
end here too. I think it fits in this situation. And I don't know if this is a question or a comment. I think it's both. is it possible to upgrade presence by subtraction rather than addition? Basically, can less be more?
Sure. I mean, depending on what we're talking about, sure. I mean, I think about that through the lens of storytelling. Like, are there parts of your story that need to kind of, turn down the volume? But also then behaviorally, are there certain, behaviors perhaps that are showing up that maybe it's time to at the very least reduce those? And maybe it's just reduction. Maybe you're not putting anything in its place. You could very well be. But like for example, maybe someone always feels compelled in the meeting to speak up, to say something. This is something very practical. You could try this afternoon, anyone out there. Maybe you're self-aware to know that you find that you're always the voice in the room. Okay, well, this afternoon, if you're in a meeting, don't do that. Say, you know
Yeah.
what? I'm just going to tone it down and I'm going to try to listen more to what other people around me are saying. And if anything, I may just work on acknowledging something they've said or summarizing back to them what they've said so they know that I've been listening. Quick example, at least.
Yep.
Um, Familiar questions. I threw these up for the other two domains. I'm throwing them up once more. Just something again for your own mind's eye to consider, whether it's you, someone you're coaching, someone on your team. When we think about appearance, approachability, influence, effectiveness, what are the thoughts that are popping up? What's true? What's not? What's the impact? What's the outcome? What's worth keeping? What's worth tossing? All right. And the very last slide I have for you, and I mentioned this at the beginning of today's conversation, one thing. I can't take credit for this. This is a tried and true practice. When you think about what we talked about today, what's one thing you could stop doing, even at the lowest of lows? What's one thing you think you could start doing? And get very tactical, get specific. When it's vague or ambiguous, action dies for it. And what's one thing you think you could continue doing? Like literally, even if you have 1 minute after this webinar, like write it down, put it on a sticky note, stick it next to your laptop, whatever it needs to be. But my hope is that with what we've shared today, and the ebook should now be in the chat, so you should have that model, it's in your hands. What can you do to make it sticky? I am entirely confident everyone on this call is confident at one thing in their lives. They have achieved some level of mastery. And why is that? Because they had intention, they had practice, and they had consistency. Executive presence is no stranger to that. Intention setting, be specific with what you intend and what you practice, and be consistent in your efforts. That's how we fit. Any other questions? I know we have a few minutes before the end of the hour. I just want to take this moment to say thank you all for your attendance. We greatly appreciate your participation in our community.
And there was a question about the ebook as well. We are having a little trouble in the chat putting in a PDF today for some reason. So sorry about that, but we will be sending you an email. We have everybody's email with
Yeah.
the replay of the webinar. So if you want to go back and look at anything, I know there was a question or comment about the like looking back at the gravitas definition, you'll be able to do that. And we'll send you the ebook. There is a place on our website where you can download the ebook. It's a gated page, so I didn't want to send you to that, so you had to put in your name and email. But it is on our website. But please know you'll get it. It's I think 12 pages long. It has a lot of what was talked about today in a nice, compact space for you to reflect on, do the action planning Joe mentioned. Think about places in your organization where you could develop leaders. And of course, if you want to talk further about this work, what Joe talked about today, whether it's coaching a leader, running the day-long training class that we have on this, we'd love to talk with you more about that. Joe, thank you. It's fun to share the virtual
Steve,
stage with you as we do these
always
webinars
a pleasure.
together. Thanks so
Yep.
much for your time and expertise.
Likewise. Appreciate everyone. Appreciate you, Steve. Appreciate everyone's attendance today. Wishing you best wishes. And hey, if this kind of thing piques your curiosity and interest, reach out. I'm here with open arms, ready to have that conversation. So I'd love to hear from you.